one of the most beautiful books ever made now lies at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. It was a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, that great Persian poem of love and loss, but this was no ordinary copy of the Rubaiyat. It was the most lavish and ambitious ever created, known as the Great Omar. And that's because it was housed in a spectacular jewelled binding made by the firm of Sangorski and Sutcliffe, who had become well known for their extravagant bindings and exquisite illuminated manuscripts, but they'd never before made something of this scale. The commission the binders received was simple: make the greatest modern binding in the world, whatever the cost. It took Francis Sangorski 2 years to make the binding, and when finished it housed an amazing 1,051 jewels, rubies, emeralds, topazes. It was made up of thousands of pieces of inlaid leather and contained scores of square feet of gold leaf. A hefty, bejewelled book of this nature needed a hefty price tag, but the bookseller who originally commissioned it failed to sell it, and so on the 29th of March 1912 it was consigned to auction, where it was bought by an American for less than half of the original asking price. So now it needed to be sent overseas, and it narrowly missed a crossing of the Atlantic on the 6th of April. And so it went on its final journey 4 days later, on a ship as grand, ambitious and ill-fated as the book itself, RMS Titanic. But that's not where the tragedy ends with this story, because the Great Omar was remade only to be destroyed again. And also on board the Titanic on that fatal voyage was one of the greatest book collectors of his time, aged only 27. So that's how one of the most beautiful books ever made went down with the Titanic and now lies at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. But the story of what happened next is why this most beautiful and extravagant of books is considered cursed. 10 weeks after the Titanic sank, the creator of the Great Omar, the master bookbinder Francis Sangorski, drowned off the Sussex coast, aged only 37. It was a huge loss to the London book trade and to the craft of bookbinding. But 20 years later, with the original book and its creator lost to the world, a young member of the same bookbinding firm found Francis Sangorski's original designs in the company's safe. It took him years to craft a second jewel-encrusted Great Omar, and it was finished just as the Second World War was beginning. To protect the book during the war, it was stored in the safest place they could think of, in a secure vault in the City of London on Fore Street. But in yet another tragic turn for this story, Fore Street would be the very first street in the City of London, bombed during the Blitz. Air raids over the next 2 years decimated the area, and when the devastation was finally cleared and the vault was found among the rubble, the book was destroyed, not torn asunder by bombs falling from the sky, but melted by the heat of the fire. So who was the young 27-year-old man, one of the great book collectors of his day, who lost his life on the Titanic? Well, the great bookseller A.S.W. Rosenbach wrote of him that, had he lived, he'd have been the greatest collector the world had ever known. And a testament to this great collection now stands in glorious brick as Harvard University's Widener Library, in memory of Harry Elkins Widener. In his short but remarkable collecting career, he amassed over 3,000 volumes of rare books and manuscripts, great works of literature, rare Bibles, all 4 Shakespeare folios. And before he boarded the Titanic in 1912, he'd been on a book buying trip to London. And one of the final books he bought on the trip was this, the rare 1598 second edition of Francis Bacon's Essays, which he bought for £260. It's a lovely little book, a small duodecimo with some 50 leaves, and while most of the haul from his book buying trip was sent back home in tin-lined trunks aboard the Carpathia, Widener wanted to bring this little book home in his pocket. There's no need to rehash what happened after the Titanic left Southampton in April 1912. Now most people associate Widener, and quite rightly so, with this grand book collection at Harvard. But whenever I think of him and of this tragedy, I think of that modest little book of Bacon's Essays, and of course of its author, who finishes his essay on death by quoting "Extinctus imabitur idem." The same man that was envied while he lived shall be loved when he's gone.